Thank you to the Segal Foundation for hosting this important conversation. I am June Josephs-Langa, and I'll be moderating this breakout session. As part of the BMW Foundation's group of responsible leaders last year, I had the great pleasure of participating with other leaders from across the various continents in what we called deep listening practice. And in my work as a strategy consultant for organizations, from global development organizations and NGOs, businesses, including to women-led social enterprises right here in my community in South Africa, on how to deepen the impact of their work for change and development. It's often expected that I would offer the answers. So when I was asked by the Segal Foundation to craft a session on leadership in Africa, I wanted to, both as part of deep listening practice and also my own personal philosophy that solutions really come from co-creating, I rather crafted a question, which is the title of this session. My co-collaborators on this panel are themselves leaders and voices for change from various spheres of work and development on the African continent, from business and the circular economy to climate activism and strategy development around the extractives industry and accountability. So together to have that conversation, we hope to imagine the African future we desire and to deeply listen and hear each other on leadership and also to engage with you as the audience. So I really thank you for joining us. And I will start by introducing my co-moderator, that is Douglas Kativu. He's the Africa Regional Head of the Global Reporting Initiative, as many of you know as GRI. But also interestingly, Douglas is also someone with whom I and other climate scientists and artists and activists co-created a climate train journey in the lead up to the UN COP17 that was held in South Africa. And with the collective on the climate train, we were able to engage with communities, smallholder farmers, and rural people who are often left out of the multilateral negotiations and the high science discussions, and yet are most impacted. So Douglas, welcome, my co-moderator of the session. Can I give you a few minutes to just tell us about yourself and the work you do at GRI?
All right, thank you, June, and thank you for extending the opportunity to co-create and design this session. I think co-creation, more stakeholder inclusivity, those are some of the key currencies that we hold dearly as an organization at GRI. Most of the work that we do, the development of the standards, the governance of the organization, different governance bodies, pretty much led by stakeholders that are drawn from different stakeholder groups, from different geographical areas and so forth. At GRI, we envision a sustainable future that is enabled by transparency and dialogue around sustainability impacts. To this end, we deliver a comprehensive and widely applicable set of sustainability reporting standards that enable organizations to provide information on their impacts on sustainable development in a way that is consistent and enables comparison and decision making. To this topic, our standards include a comprehensive set of disclosures that promote good corporate governance practices, including the role of the board of directors in an organization or the equivalent higher structure in the organization, their role in setting organizational purpose, value, strategy, as well as them being accountable over the organization's sustainability impacts. So this is quite a topical issue for us as well in terms of building responsible and accountable leaders across the world, and more so in Africa. And personally, I've been engaged in the sustainability space for more than 20 years now. And thank you for the opportunity. I will hand back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Douglas. Next, as part of this panel of other beautiful human beings who are working for change, I'd like to introduce Makoma Lekalakala. She is a South African activist who's also the director of the Johannesburg branch of Earthlife Africa. She has long been a worker community activist for social change, and she's also a board member of Natural Justice. Makoma, would you like to say hello and just tell us what you hope is going to come out of this panel discussion on a sustainable future for Africa?
Good evening. Good evening to all, the panel and the participants. My name is Makoma Lekalakala, and I'm from Earthlife Africa Johannesburg, which is an environmental justice organization which partners with people's organizations, particularly those that are not heard. And one of the things that we do partnering with people's organization is for them to be part of decision making. See that in the context where we live in our continent, most of the time people who find themselves impacted negatively, particularly by climate change, people who experience floods, droughts, are not part of decision making. So from this panel or from this discussion, I hope that we'll be able to bring up and insights as to what is needed, the future that we all want, that we envision, the future which would make us act on the kind of crisis and also of the struggles that we face with on an everyday basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Makoma. Next, it is my great pleasure to also introduce another panel member, Dr. Claude Cabemba. Dr. Claude Cabemba is the director of Southern Africa Resource Watch. He is both an academic, an activist, does work around transparency and accountability with the extractives industry across the African continent. And Claude also heads up OSISA's Natural Resources Governance Initiative. Welcome, Claude. Would you like to let our audience hear your voice? You're on mute, Claude. Hi, Claude.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. The Southern Africa Resource Watch, the organization I represent, promotes good governance of Africa's mineral resources. As you know, Africa's got abundant mineral resources. And these mineral resources are the only comparative advantage the continent has to pivot toward a sustainable development. Our main focus is really to promote transparency, accountability, but you are first and foremost a human rights-based organization. We focus on marginalized groups, such as mining communities, women, and indigenous people, looking at how mining activities are affecting their lives and their environment. But we also reflect on how Africa can optimally benefit from these abundant mineral resources. So what we are looking at through this panel, this conversation, is what type of commitment and leadership we need in this at this particular time when we are facing so many challenges, both internal and external, to ensure that we position Africa in a sustainable way, engaging with external partners to resolve its internal challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Claude. And finally, last but certainly not least, I would like to introduce Dr. Ndidi Nnoli-Edozien, joining us all the way from Nigeria. Dr. Nnoli-Edozien is herself a social entrepreneur and corporate sustainability and responsibility expert. She has held positions at the Lagos School of Business, as well as been the Chief Sustainability and Governance Officer for a range of large corporates. Ndidi is the bottom of the pyramid empowerment advocate, an academic who does lots of work around the Circular Economy Innovation Partnership. She is the managing partner at Afrikairos. Welcome, Ndidi.
Thank you, June. It's been interesting listening to all of these, and it's always very humbling to be pinpointed to speak for, as you said, the base of the pyramid. And perhaps the most important work that I've done so far, which has spanned 21 years, is to have founded an organization called Growing Businesses Foundation, which speaks for especially women at the base of the pyramid, and has sought to bring economic, social, and ecological opportunities or access to enable the ideas that already exist. When we talk about 2063, we talk about the Africa that we want. And that Africa that we want, that agenda was defined actually before the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, the power of marketing. We need to begin from where we are. We need to begin from what we have. And June, you were complimenting my backdrop. These are actually 4 different pieces of art. One of my favorite artists, his name is Nnoli-Edozien, and he just finished an exhibition in Lagos. And because I'm his friend, and he lives in a very remote location, he asked me to pick up his pieces of art. So I sent him a photo, and I said to him, I'm using your art as a backdrop for the Future Africa Summit. And his art, the reason why I love it so much is it's made out of waste. It's made out of consumer waste. So every single one of these pieces are little elements of consumer waste strung together. And his philosophy was actually created outside of his home country, where he, decided that in Nigeria, we have a lot of street hawkers. So women who carry their wares on their head. And one of the things that the Growing Businesses Foundation does is that it contributes 5% of Unilever's revenues in Nigeria from 5,000 women who sell to 450,000 households. And that's how they feed their families. But the point is that cumulatively together, they constitute 5% of Unilever's annual revenues in Nigeria. That's huge. And a lot of them carry this on their head. And so this particular piece over here is made up of many of those little things that they balance on their heads in order to carry their trays, in order to sell their food. And that message is a message of human dignity. It's a message of honoring the woman. It's a message of honoring work, dignified, meaningful work. And in that regard, I think it's really exciting that you're having this conference that speaks to the future, and that speaks to the future from the voices of those that we least hear.
Thank you, Ndidi. I mean, what a powerful way of bringing in exactly all that sums up this session. immediately into your introduction. And really, the session is trying to answer this big question about what does the leadership pivot for a sustainable African future look like? And I think already in honoring the artists and in honoring the women, we're already beginning to take steps towards what some of those answers could be. Interestingly, people asked about why pivot? Why do we feel we need to include the word pivot? Why do we need a pivot? And I think we can't have this conversation without at least framing that we have this conversation at a time when we're both in the middle of a pandemic, as well as seeing a climate crisis manifesting around us, with the intersections of poverty and inequality. And I thought just one quote we would share, which we thought as moderators frames how we want to weave our way through this conversation. Because as Arundhati Roy says, whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists, and in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. So because pandemics force humans to break with the past and imagine the world anew, I just want us to maybe reflect in the spaces that you are, as leaders on the continent and in the areas of work that you've just outlined for us. What did that rupture look like for you? And what did that mean for people who occupy spaces in the world where you sit? If I can start perhaps with yourself, Claude.
I want to speak to the area in which we operate. As you know, my sense is that any change, a break from the past in the current situation can only come from a determined leadership which operates on strong values, patriotism, and conviction to pivot. You take the case of the mineral sector, which can help Africa to quickly move into a transformative development. That sector at the current moment is operated to serve other societies than to serve the continent. And this has been so for centuries. As we fight with the COVID-19, mining in most of countries on the continent at the peak of COVID-19 was considered as an essential service. Operations were allowed to continue. And this situation exposed few things that we think we need to interrogate, because they expose the social structures at the national and international level. Let me just give you a picture of what happened to understand the difficulties in which the continent is and why we need to change. By allowing mining to continue in an effort to protect multinational bottom line, we expose mine workers and mining communities to the virus. In so doing, we overlooked their human rights. Some mining companies, to secure production, resorted to desperate measures, including confinement of workers on mining sites in a very inhumane conditions, extended workers' hours, and a number of companies did not have adequate, sufficient personal protective equipment. That one. Secondly, COVID-19 exposed Africa's vulnerability and dependence on the external world. Despite the fact that our government across the continent made mining an essential service, we were not able to sell our minerals to the market because we are not consumers of our own minerals, but we export them. And that poses a much bigger problem in terms of dealing with the challenge of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, because the mining sector can be an engine for transformation. So the point I'm making here, and what we do in my organization, is that we need to adjust to find a way to continue to protect human rights of those marginalized groups in these difficult times. What we think needs to be done, we need to move using one of the difficulties we've had, Julie, is that our work, which is to protect these communities, could not go forward because we are using technology today. And we met serious challenges, limitation to reach the constituencies that we serve. Global movement building and advocacy are now done online, cutting costs and changing ways of working. And this community we serve don't have access to this mechanism, to this technology. So it starts to raise significant questions. How COVID has disrupted our work and have left the private sector's activity unchecked on their impact on these marginalized groups. As for me, this moment has meant a reflection on what Africa needs to do to resolve current and future challenges. The question on my mind has been, what should we do collectively as Africans and individually to position Africa differently? And that for me is an important one. If we do not do that and build up a leadership that responds to these challenges, we will have difficulty to pivot into a sustainable manner.
Thanks for that, Claude. It will provide a useful segue to the next few questions that we have for you. I would just like, though, to allow Makoma and Ndidi to just share with us also what this rupture has meant in the work they do and in the corners that they find themselves. So Ndidi, can I invite you to just share with us and reflect?
Yes, of course. Thank you. I'm talking about mining. I mean, you know, I think COP26 and the movement towards net zero and the significant changes that are taking place all across the world at the moment, with the IFRS embracing sustainability reporting and SASB and the Value Foundation and, you know, changes, Douglas, as you know, with the GRI and the, what do they call them? The big five, or I forget what the terminology is now. I think this whole pandemic that we've seen, a time where, because we all had to stop flying and stop moving and stay at home, there were parts of the world where we saw blue skies again. We now have a new Blue Skies Day. And I think what it did was it gave us hope. I think in the midst of, somehow we say that, you know, when you seize victory from the jaws of defeat. I think that's what humanity did. I know it's been a really hard time. I personally have faced a lot of losses. It's been very painful, but I've also found a lot of joys. It's kind of been a returning to the roots, a returning to the basics. And if it was possible to take away gray skies and to eliminate pollution from cities. I mean, one of the circular economy innovation projects is the project called Circular Lagos. Lagos is Africa's most populous city. It's also one of the world's mega cities, and it's the biggest city on the African continent. And working with the Lagos state government, we launched not just Circular Lagos in November 2020, but just a couple of days ago, we also launched the Circular Business Platform. And anybody who's following the storyline on circular economy, this is fundamental. It's a fundamental shift, moving from a linear economy where we're using without control and without consideration natural resources. And at the end of the value chain and supply chain, we're delivering waste. I mean, you can see from the look on my face, actually, it's just not acceptable. And sometimes it requires a pandemic and it requires a disaster to bring us to our senses and sober us up and cause us to create a change. And one of the things that I always say when people talk to me about circular economy is I say, don't bring circular economy to Africa. We've always been circular. We think in a circular way. We've always been much more conscious about how we use our natural resources. And as a people and as a culture and as a community, we've always been much more connected with Mother Earth. In my own culture, the earth is called Allah and Ani. You know, we have a name for the streams and for the rivers. The sky is a god or a goddess. So we recognize the deity in living systems. We don't, you know, create living systems to become assets that one can use and dispose of at will. No, they have rights. They have rights like human beings have rights, and we are obliged to respect nature. Where did I see the most significant changes in my ecosystem? It was in the creation on our part of this entity called Circular Economy Innovation Partnership. And in collaboration with my 21-year-old foundation, the Growing Businesses Foundation, which I described earlier, here's the magical thing that happened. Whereas previously what we would do is these 5,000 women supported by 300 youth who are doing the logistics and the technology and the hand-holding and the marketing and the capacity building, serving 450,000 households across Nigeria. What we were doing prior to COVID is simply delivering resources like soap or cooking needs. Now, what happened during COVID is that soap took on a new meaning because our rural women become health ambassadors. And what they do when they deliver a bar of soap is they became the ambassadors that said, remember to wash your hands because this is the way you save lives. Remember to wear a mask. It doesn't matter. You don't have to buy a fancy mask. Just put anything over your face. Remember to make masks locally and sell them because this may save lives. And what is interesting is now that we're getting a grasp of the pandemic and we're asking ourselves where to from here, what we're seeing as a change is that we are now exploring with the large corporates and with the state governments, how do we deliver resources to the base of the pyramid? And how do we collect waste in a manner that it can be recycled, upcycled, reused? And how do we reward people or incentivize people at the household level, at the rural level, for being more responsible about their waste, just as responsible as they are about their natural resources? That is a big shift that is coming with Build Back Better. So, I mean, for me, it is, look, disasters happen all the time. I think it's within our control to choose how we choose to steer a ship. We are captains of the ship, and the Africa we want in 2063 is within our control. And it has to be within all of our control. And we've got to collaborate and make that vision real. And no disaster and no pandemic is going to hold us back from this.
Thank you, Ndidi. That's exactly the impetus and drive that we're hoping this moment is taking us to. Makoma, you, like all of us, would have welcomed the blue skies and the fact that the planes stopped flying and we got to see new species return to their natural environments. So just from your perspective, the pandemic has highlighted the intersections with inequality, with poverty. And I think we're simultaneously at this juncture of seeing the manifestations of the climate crisis. And I just want you to reflect for us on this moment.
Thank you, and thank you very much. I think one thing that the pandemic has shown is that change can happen and change is imminent. And we've seen that in a very short space of time, something so minuscule could house a rest of humanity. And what we also have seen is that this pandemic has actually displayed that we can have decisive leadership. Heads of governments acted swiftly in response to the pandemic. And the question that we ask is it because the virus does not discriminate? We have seen that it went across all sectors, all classes, and maybe that's why there was that kind of decisive leadership. But however, it also questions us as to why is there no such decisive leadership when it comes to the climate crisis that we're facing. And this pandemic, I think, has provided an opportunity, not only for African leaders, but for all leaders in the world to reflect and remove the stumbling blocks that prevent change, that prevent mitigation against climate change. People are already living in harder times, and because in many areas, people are recovering from extreme weather patterns that really are disruptive to their way of life. And we know what the solutions are. The events that are taking place are actually affect the infrastructure that we have. They have got an implication on the jobs and the livelihoods that people have on their life, but also the situation that needs decisive leadership, whether African or globally, would mean that it's kind of upholding the dignity of humanity and also protecting the environment that all of us rely on, because we all are part of that environment, part of that nature. What made me happy, it's exactly what the previous speaker had said, that we suddenly were able to see the blue skies. We're able to hear sounds of different birds. We're able to also see some plants that we've never seen growing. And that meant signs of hope and change. And this change, we can all collectively make it happen if we come together and learn from the experiences that we have, and also our own way of living. We have Ubuntu that actually we saw happening, being revived during the early days of the pandemic, where people would come together, share food, share crops, and learn and share adaptation mechanisms. And we can go back to our ancient wisdoms like your Sankofa to say what happened in a particular era. Is it practical today? Is it something that we can put across, try to practice again so that we can bring about that much needed change? But for African governments, African heads of states, I think it's important for them to realize, and I think this was like the pandemic brought a cold face to say you have to do something about you being part of this multilateral bodies, this multilateral discussions as to whether, how do you break the North-South divide? The situation that we find ourselves in the pandemic, people can say there's so many origins and myths, and at the same time, it tells us that we have to do something, and doing that, it should mean for African governments to say, because of the vaccination politics, the geopolitics of vaccination, as to whether the North are still serving us, or whether some of the kind of multilateral bodies that we have, are they still serving us? But then it's time to ask for those that have wronged, those that have created the crisis that we find ourselves in, to start paying up the climate debt, because we need to adapt. And Africa is one of the continents that suffers most. When the climate crisis, the climate emergency, the climate disruption is there, it's Africans who actually feel much more or carry the burden more than the North. And this is the time that we call for that, so that we can be able to live longer, much better, and uphold the dignity of humanity.
Thanks, Makoma. And in fact, I really appreciate that all three of you have brought in the themes around our indigenous knowledges and our ways of doing things, because often with our history of getting to this point of devaluing the richness in our ways of living and sharing what we have amongst each other, we've somehow had that devalued. And maybe this does give us reason to pause and say, with all the models that have been broken, isn't it time for us as Africans to really look back at what we've lost and what we need to bring back to be part of imagining this new future we want for ourselves and for generations to come? And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Douglas, who wants to talk about exactly that future generation. How do we bring them into the conversation? Over to you, Douglas.
All right. Thank you, John. Before I get to the question on the youth, I would like to bring back Dr. Cabemba, and it's quite agreed that the abundant resources that we have should shift the continent from dependence to greater economic inclusion and participation to address poverty, inequality, and social justice, like you mentioned in your opening remarks. And if you look at recent policies at national, regional, and continental levels, most of them recognize this and even champion value addition of the resources that you mentioned. However, the challenges still perpetuate. What should the political as well as business leaders do to make the continent's rich resources work for her citizens? What are the challenges? Why are we not seeing this coming to fruition or materializing?
Thank you, Douglas. There are two problems, internal problems and the external one. You'll remember that since independence, we have come up with policies and visions to ensure that we optimally benefit from our resources. But those visions have never been implemented. You remember that the fight for independence was not just political, it was also economic. It was about land and it was about reclaiming our resources. Mm-hmm. That has not happened. Africa has been locked into a grip of control by the external world in terms of its abundant resources. And the model that we are using is not appropriate for us to benefit optimally from these resources. Our policy option is focusing on monetary policies instead of us focusing on industrialization, using minerals as a base to industrialize, to create linkages, both backward and forward linkages. This is not happening despite the political rhetoric that we follow across our continent. Yes, we've come up now with Vision 2063. We have put in place the African mining vision, but there is not political push to implement those. And the challenge we have is that as we delay that pivot, we widen inequality and we deepen poverty, because those resources, for us to benefit, we need to understand that what others did with their own resources. And that has been value addition to those resources. And we are failing to do that. Now, externally, what is happening? Because of all the modernization, the new technology, the climate change, energy transition, and so on, Africa, with all its abundant resources, there is a rush for resources that are on the continent. Powers around the world are competing to access these resources. And by doing that, they are also capturing our political leaders and putting them in a model of economic system that does not resolve our problem. So my sense, Douglas, is that we need to go to the basics. We need to find African models of using those resources in a way that respond to our need. Africa is the only continent that needs more of those resources because we need infrastructure here. We need roads, we need bridges, we need electricity, we need the clean water. And those resources are important for achieving that. So certainly we need to resolve to see how we engage in a win-win partnership with the rest of the world, but we also need to have a leadership that understands the current challenge and future challenge. Because in resolving the problem we have for resources, we build a better future and protect the resources for future generations.
Thank you, Claude. And if I may also add that in addition to what you have said, we also need to stop the leakages, especially if you look at tax avoidance schemes. If you have read the reports of the OECD, I think from a couple of years ago, the annual loss to the continent is estimated to be around 50 billion US dollars that the continent loses in terms of elaborate tax avoidance systems. And even the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa estimates the figure at a much higher $100 billion that the continent loses every year. So we need to stop those leakages in addition to what you have said, because what we are losing is much more than what we receive in terms of aid from other countries. And still on the resources question, Dr. Ndidi, Claude mentioned earlier on that our natural resources is one of the comparative advantages that the continent has over other continents. But what is also emerging is that our young population is actually also going to be a greater comparative advantage, a greater currency for the continent going into the future. What should we do as a continent to make sure that the resources that Claude mentioned also work for the youth? How can we make the continent and its resources work for the youth? How can we maximize on this demographic dividend going into the future?
That's a really great question. I think what's really helped us on the African continent, it's funny because, you know, sometimes people tell me that we need to bring feminism to Africa. And when I listen to them, I tell them, you haven't seen strong women until you have come to the African continent. African women don't have to shout that they're strong. They just are. They control things. They move the economy. And if you think that they don't, you're joking, or you're not seeing reality. Now, what's happening is one of the things that's very important to understand about our continent, about our cities, about our countries, and most importantly about our communities, is that what the world sees is only the surface. They don't see what goes on underneath. And, you know, when I think about women, or when I think about youth, or when I think about the informal sector that drives our economies, I think of the idea of a swan, you know, or a duck. When you see it gliding on the surface of the water, it looks so elegant. But when you look very closely, you see that underneath the water, those feet are furiously paddling. Or likewise, when you watch salmon swimming upstream, salmon, this famous pink fish, this outlier, you think that it just swims upstream because it wants to. No, it knows that upstream is where it breeds. That's where it multiplies. And so when you watch it doing what seems to be impossible or stupid or foolish, like a lot of the time, what we do, and I start from women because I think that, you know, we don't call Africa Mama Africa by chance. We don't say that in African culture, in my own traditional culture, the Igbo culture, that we are held by Mother Earth, who we call Allah or Ani, by chance. And you see, it is mothers that nurture children. Sometimes it's also fathers who play the role of nurturer. And then they say that, well, this father acts like a mother. And so when we talk about our youth, one of the things that we need to ask ourselves is, what is our intergenerational relationship with our younger generation? And just like we say that over 50% of the African population is female, over 60% of the African demography is young. Yeah. What does that mean? Now, what I see is, I don't see a problem. I see an opportunity. And let me tell you where I see that opportunity. First of all, 10 years of my life was spent in the telecommunications sector. And in those 10 years, what I witnessed is a situation where 20 or 30 years of old infrastructure yielded for Nigerian people 400,000 landlines. Those old lines that sit in one place, that when you hear the phone ring, you have to run from one part of the house to the other part of the house. 400,000 lines. Within 10 years, 80 million lines. Think about it. It wasn't double, that would have been 800,000. It wasn't double times 10, that would have been 8 million. It wasn't double, it was double times 100. That's real. And this is exactly what happens if we have the courage to allow two things to happen on the African continent. And we've spoken about it on this chat. One is we have to have the humility to listen to the next generation because they can see the future and we cannot. And the younger generation has got
I think we have lost your sound there. Dr. Ndidi. Beatrice, can you check with the technical people if you can get back Dr. Ndidi?
I do think Dr. Ndidi will log on onto another device. I do think though, Douglas, she was making, yes, okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm switching devices.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Excellent.
I don't think the image from this one is as good. I'm sorry.
It's perfect.
That's okay, Doctor.
Okay, hold on. Let's try this.
We lost you again, Doctor.
And we really enjoyed honoring the artists as well. So we have you back now.
You can hear me now?
Probably you can switch off the camera and we'll just do with the audio.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes,
we
loud
can.
and clear.
Okay, I'm just gonna leave computer audio on the other one, and then I'm gonna move fully over to this one, and we'll be fine. Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Technology. This is the reason why I have two devices. So I learned this from my daughters, actually. They told me, Ndidi, you better have two devices because one of them will disappoint you. But what I wanted to say, just to land this point, is it's not just that we need to allow our younger generation and allow this intergenerational dialogue. Our younger generation has also got to, you know, have the wisdom to lean on some of us who have a little bit more experience. And that's only if we have the humility to let them know that we are truly willing to listen. And one of the things that I think that we really need to do, those of us who have the privilege, and that is a privilege, to speak on behalf of millions, because there are very few of us who get this chance to speak, to represent the base of the pyramid, or to represent the youth, or to represent our ancestry, is we have to understand and take into cognizance the wisdom of past generations. We need to look into those indigenous best practices that have worked in the past. We need to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be authentically African? What does it mean to step out into the world and speak, whether it's in Europe or the US, undaunted by what anybody else tells us of how the world should be constituted? Because if we lived life the way the Europeans do, we would need 2.5 Earths. So when they talk about sustainability and how we should embrace sustainability practices, I always say, excuse me, we're not the ones polluting the world. As Africans, we have the smallest environmental footprint. So what needs to happen is that we need to be empowered and we need to be invested in to do more of what we do. Because guess what? Our people are not poor. What we have is we have a lot of dignity. We have a lot of entrepreneurial ability. We have a lot of drive. We may have limited resources in terms of financial capital, but as the old native Indians, and I know that's the wrong politically incorrect term, but I don't know what the right term is right now, Navajo Indians said, at the end of the day, are you going to eat money? And guess what? If you go by the younger generation, we're all turning to blockchain and cryptocurrency. So what you call dollar and euros today, day after tomorrow is not going to exist. What you call mainstream banking today, day after tomorrow is not going to exist. We're recreating a world that is completely different. And just like we're moving from the linear economy, where you take natural resources, you produce things and you end up with more waste than you need, we're moving into a circular economy. Likewise, I think that the younger generation, provided that we give them voices and a seat at the table, and the ancient wisdom, provided that we have the humility to look back and look inside and be proud of who we are and what we already have and what we already know. And we come to the table not asking for a seat, but redesigning the table and insisting that we stand where we stand because we have value to bring. And actually, the world has a lot to learn from the African continent, and especially from our youth, who are the emblems, who are the symbols, who are the powerhouse of our future. And I would dare say that we have the bulk of them.
Thank you, Ndidi. And indeed, the youth, young people are pretty much a force for progressive change, driving innovation and development. But like you said, we also need to balance intergenerational leadership. We also need to bring them into positions of responsibility. And we also need to plug the leakage, what I would say, the leakage. We recognize youth as the biggest currents going into the future, but we are also losing our youth to other regions. We should make the continent work for the youth as well. With an eye on the clock, I don't know if there are any questions from the attendees, but maybe also to bring back June and Makoma into the conversation.
Thank you, Douglas. Actually, there was a question from Babi Rai. I'm not sure where she's joining us from, but nonetheless, in fact, I think her question has been answered by Ndidi around the youth. And Babi Rai was asking about, she's seen the youth, he or she has seen the youth trying to organize themselves. What then seems to be their greatest limiting factor, as they don't see the actions translated into impact and real results. And I think Ndidi has shared with us some really useful insights around the two things that could help us to bring our youth to the table, recreating that table. And we've seen quite good moves around youth coming back with their skills to invest in the African continent, which I think is a positive investment and a positive move and shift back to the continent. We have just, I think, 1 minute left. And so I will give an opportunity for you to very briefly, Makoma, as you haven't said anything in a while, just tell us, what is that sustainable African future you imagine?
Thank you. Just to say that I want to say young people are the future. They are the invisible power that hold the key to the future. And that Africa is bestowed with natural resources does not mean that the rights of the people and the rights of nature should be
I think we may have lost Makoma. I think perhaps to end the session, we will just end.
She's back now. Maybe you can give her the opportunity to finish your point.
Okay, maybe just like to repeat again, I was saying young people are the future, and they are the invisible power that hold the key to the future. And also that Africa is bestowed with natural resources does not mean that the rights of nature and people's rights should be ignored. African leaders need to prioritize the well-being of its people. Thank you.
Thank you, Makoma. So I think to close the session, we'll just use the words of Dr. Matshidiso Moeti, the World Health Organization Regional Director for Africa, who said, African leaders, governments, and people should all say loudly, I know who I am, I accept myself, and I will move forward on my own terms. So partner world, partner with us on an equal basis towards imagining the sustainable future for Africa we desire and are prepared to fight for. Thank you to everyone who has joined us, and let's keep working for change in the corners that we find ourselves in. I thank you.